We are opening the archives today for a really special one. We're diving deep into one of the great what-ifs of modern animation history. It is the comprehensive, highly detailed, and, well, ultimately abandoned fourth season of Avatar, The Last Airbender.
And this is so much more than just a hypothetical, right?
Yeah.
What we're actually exploring today is it's a near mythical blueprint.
Oh, blueprint.
Yeah, one drawn up by the series' own head writer, Aaron Ehasz. And it shows us exactly what the emotional, the spiritual, and even the political landscape of the Avatarverse would have looked like right after the war ended.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really unearth those specific, incredible nuggets of knowledge. We want to understand the high-stakes creative and, business decisions that stopped season 4 right in its tracks.
And then get into the unbelievably layered character arcs that were lost. I mean, especially Azula's really difficult redemption and this surprising lifelong spiritual burden that Aang was meant to carry.
Right.
You should think of this as the ultimate shortcut to understanding the potential path not taken in this franchise. It's a path that focused not on finding some new villain, but on the painful, necessary work of healing a broken world and broken people.
And to really appreciate what was lost, you have to kind of rewind your mind back to 2008.
Yeah.
The anticipation for the season 3 finale, Sozin's Come, it was more than just palpable. It was a genuine cultural event.
Oh, absolutely. This was squarely in the middle of Nickelodeon's golden era. And culturally, the Wii was selling out everywhere.
I remember it.
And Avatar was hitting its absolute peak influence. It was a phenomenon.
And the network knew exactly what they had on their hands, right?
They did. They completely stopped treating Avatar like just another cartoon and started treating it like this massive cultural moment.
Which is why they chose to market that 4-part finale as a full-blown animated summer blockbuster.
Exactly. They did something truly unprecedented for that kind of series.
What was that?
They broadcast all 4 parts across 2 nights on primetime television.
Primetime. That's a huge vote of confidence.
It is. And that marketing strategy, well, it paid off in ways they probably didn't even dare to dream of.
Okay, so let's get into the numbers because they really tell the story here.
The numbers are staggering, and they highlight why the cancellation is so painful. Each episode of that 4-part finale hit over 5.5 million live viewers.
5.5 million.
Live.
Just to put that viewership into proper perspective for you. Most animated series at the time were doing well if they were comfortably landing, maybe 1.5 to 2 million viewers per episode?
At best, yeah. But here's where it gets really interesting.
Go on.
Even Nickelodeon's flagship, their biggest hits, think of major SpongeBob special. They usually maxed out around 4 to 5 million on their very biggest nights.
So Avatar wasn't just meeting expectations.
No, it completely set a new bar for how much a fan base would show up for a serialized animated story. It was a total game changer.
And you know what? Critically, they earned that massive audience. That finale felt truly cinematic.
Oh, it did. The fluidity of the animation, the dramatic lighting.
Zuko and Azula's iconic Aang Nikai.
Of course. And Aang's final battle, where he finally chose to return to the Avatar state, it just showed this growth and spiritual power that went so far beyond just bending.
It felt conclusive, high quality, and deeply emotional. It really did.
Yeah.
And yet, after the world is saved, Zuko is crowned Fire Lord, and the gang is finally sharing a quiet. We get that incredible, sharp final line just moments before the credits roll. Zuko turns to Ozai in his prison and asks, with this palpable weight, "Where is my mother?"
And that isn't just some loose thread they left for the comic books to pick up later.
No.
That line, positioned right there before the definitive end of the initial story,
yes.
It was an explicit narrative setup. It was a promise.
A promise of a new focus, right?
Yeah.
The shift from saving the world to, I guess, rediscovering personal history and embarking on this immense task of political and familial reconstruction.
Exactly. So the quality was stellar, the viewership was at a blockbuster level, and the story literally generated its own sequel hook right there in the final seconds.
So why? Why did the creative gravity of that story promise to just fade to black? If they were pulling 5.5 million viewers, surely Nickelodeon would have begged for season 4.
And that is the central pivot point of this whole discussion. We know now that very real, very detailed discussions were happening behind the scenes about continuing the animated story immediately.
It was on the table.
It was more than on the table. The head writer of the series, Aaron Ehasz, he confirmed that co-creator Michael Dante DiMartino approached him directly.
About what?
About the possibility of Ehasz stepping up to run a 4th animated season.
Wow.
It was moments away from happening.
Wow. So what happened?
Well, plans shifted with brutal speed. According to Ehasz, the reason was singular and focused entirely on commercial ambition. The original creators, Mike and Brian, they chose to divert their focus and their energy entirely toward developing the 2010 live-action movie, instead of moving forward with another animated season.
The movie we all collectively try to minimize in conversation.
The very same.
Yeah.
And the irony here is just layered. We know that even M. Night Shyamalan, the director they brought onto the film, reportedly expressed that he thought season 4 should still happen.
Even the movie's director wanted the show to continue.
Yeah, but Mike and Brian, the architects of the world, they were fully committed to the feature film instead.
Okay, we have to unpack this decision because in hindsight, it looks catastrophic.
It's tough.
But let's try to place ourselves in the creators' chairs back in 2008 when the future seemed limitless. Why choose a risky movie over a proven animated?
It's because it was presented to them as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I mean, think about it. They'd created this niche, beautiful world for cable television. And then suddenly, major Hollywood studios are offering them a massive stage, a global theatrical release, huge production budgets, and the chance to translate their vision to a live-action, mass-market medium.
The temptation to scale up like that, to bring their world to a cinematic audience that might not watch animated television, it must have been just overwhelming.
It's the ultimate validation for any creator.
And think about the risk assessment from their perspective. What's the worst-case scenario?
The movie fails critically.
Right, but even if it does, they still successfully launched one of the most beloved animated shows in history. And they stand to make a massive amount of money from the movie deal and the residuals, regardless of what the critic.
Exactly. They were betting on a huge, transformative payoff.
And that payoff was envisioned as absolutely immense by the corporate players involved.
Oh, yeah. The president of Nickelodeon at the time didn't see the movie as just a standalone feature. He saw it as the necessary launch pad for a massive, multi-decade franchise expansion.
His vision was audacious. Years before the Marvel Cinematic Universe was this fully defined juggernaut.
Completely. It wasn't just planning for The Legend of Korra to happen eventually. It was a massive, immediate expansion of the entire Avatar-verse.
Yeah.
100% dependent on the film's success.
And the projection, I read this, the projection was for up to 10 live-action movies. 10. That is the architecture of a global cinematic universe. The stakes for that 2010 film weren't just about, a gang's casting.
Yeah.
They were about the entire geopolitical future of the Avatar world being mapped out on this massive theatrical scale.
But that corporate ambition, as you can imagine, came at the cost of creative control.
We know the painful aftermath.
The creators later confirmed they had very little actual involvement in the final cut of the film. Some of them even told the original voice cast not to bother watching it.
Which is just, wow. And the critical reception was brutal, that infamous 5% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Right.
But here's the business paradox that makes this whole pivot. So the film, despite being critically savage and having awful word of mouth, it was a stunning commercial anomaly.
It's the definition of a successful failure. Our source material notes the film barely made a profit, which seems wildly strange when you realize it generated $320 million at the box office globally.
Plus an additional $50 million off DVD and home video sales.
Right.
So why does $320 million, which adjusted for inflation is nearly comparable to the successful Fantastic Four movies of that era, why does that only barely make a profit?
That takes us into the very complex world of Hollywood accounting.
Okay.
So while the film generated massive gross revenue, the net profit is what actually matters to the studio. You have to factor in the astronomical cost of a global marketing and distribution campaign, which can often equal the production budget itself.
And the studio takes its cut, the exhibitors take their cut?
Exactly. And when you're budgeting for 10 sequels, you spend aggressively on marketing the first one to establish the brand for the long haul.
So they bet the farm on expansion. They invested so heavily that even a huge box office take felt like a disappointment because it didn't return the astronomical profit margin they needed to justify immediately producing film 10.
You've got it. It was a massive critical failure that was commercially a marginal success story. And that internal contradiction is why the animated series halted. It killed the creative momentum without fully extinguishing the commercial IP.
So let's just summarize the paths here. We have 3 possible universes we could have inhabited when Aang beat Ozai.
Okay.
The first, the one we lost. A 4th animated season, potentially followed by quality sequels and expansion built directly on that strong character found.
The second universe.
Yeah.
The corporate dream. A full cinematic universe with up to 10 live-action films and continued massive animation development, all predicated on the 2010 movie being the next billion-dollar franchise starter.
And then the third path, the one we ultimately ended up on. No, season 4, the cinematic universe collapsed, and the franchise entered this long, slow recovery period that eventually gave us The Legend of Korra, and now, years later, Avatar Studio, which is slowly building new content.
It's a really powerful contrast. And as we transition now into the specific content of a lost season, it's vital to clarify for anyone who knows the franchise well.
This is a crucial...
This season 4 was absolutely not just an adaptation of the subsequent comic, which didn't even begin until 2012.
Right. The comic writers had to work around the knowledge that Korra was coming event. They had to bridge that gap.
But Aaron Ehasz was writing in a narrative vacuum. It was a pure continuation of the original story, without worrying about Tenzin being born a decade later or anything like that.
He was developing original, distinct ideas focused purely on the immediate post-war period.
Exactly. So let's shift from the business failure to the specific narrative wealth that was sacrificed.
Okay. So what's immediately captivating about the core mission statement for Season 4 is the scale of it. It wasn't about escalating the stakes. There was no new conquest needed, no new world-ending comet on the horizon.
The thematic focus of the Lost season was entirely introspective and domestic in the best possible way. It was about these young heroes learning how to navigate ordinary life after completing this extraordinary mission.
So it focused on defining who they were now that their great purpose, ending the war, had been fulfilled.
Precisely. And this shift from external conflict to internal healing, from action to psychology, it would have been a profoundly mature direction for the show to take.
And the way we know this is through these fragments that Ehasz writes, like little quotes, interviews, and one particularly stunning thread on social media.
And that thread leads us directly to the most anticipated and potentially most controversial element of the Lost season.
Which is?
Azula's difficult, highly layered redemption.
This was not an idea generated by fan demand. This was always intended by...
Always. He laid out this shocking vision in a 2019 thread, which he actually had to quickly clarify was real and not an April Fool's prank, because of the level of detail and the timing of the release.
So what was his vision? How do you redeem Azula?
Well, his vision was firm. This was never going to be an easy or a fast change. He viewed Azula's mental collapse during the Agni Kai in the finale, that moment of screaming despair when she was chained.
Yeah.
He saw that not as her hitting rock bottom, but merely as the starting point of her descent.
That's a fascinating narrative distinction. Her breakdown was the brick that allowed the real process to begin.
Yes, she would become even further emotionally fractured as the reality of her failure and her abandonment sunk in. She would be forced to confront all the immense trauma and pain she had spent her life burying under that facade of perfection and cruelty.
That's a really sophisticated understanding of abuse and trauma. It acknowledges that the moment a survivor breaks isn't the end of it.
No, it's when the deepest, hardest work of recovery truly begins. And she wouldn't have been left to do it alone.
Which leads us to this surprising architect of this transformation, Zuko.
Right.
But wait, Zuko just inherited the entire Fire Nation, which needs immediate, massive political and economic. How does he have the time or the emotional capacity to be Azula's personal therapist, too? Wouldn't that be a monumental distraction from his duties as Fire Lord?
And that's the brilliance of the arc Ehasz was planning. Zuko's political duties would have been intertwined with his personal psychological duties.
How so?
To rebuild the Fire Nation, he had to confront its most powerful symbol of the past regime, his sister.
So his role as Fire Lord is defined by his ability to show compassion and reform, even to the person who seems unredeemable.
Precise. Zuko's job was to step into the role of the compassionate God. He would offer Azula the same empathy, the same radical forgiveness, and the same resilience that Iroh and the rest of the gang had once offered him.
It's a powerful cycle.
It is. He moves from being the recipient of forgiveness to the dispenser of it, defining his new leadership not through military might, but through moral healing.
And this redemption was clearly meant to be slow and painful. The goal was for Azula to slowly transform into someone capable of expressing genuine emotion. But Ehasz specifically said she...
And that awkwardness is so critical for believability.
Yeah.
It underscores that this isn't some magical transformation.
Right.
Healing from deep systemic trauma, especially when it's rooted in parental emotional abuse and manipulation, is nonlinear. It's often frustrating, and it is certainly awkward. She wouldn't suddenly be a pleasant person.
She would just be capable of recognizing her own humanity.
Exactly.
And the narrative engine driving this whole complicated sibling dynamic was meant to be the ultimate cliffhanger, the search for Ursa, Zuko, and Azula's mother.
The mother-wound connection. Azula's pathology wasn't just linked to Ozai's encouragement of her cruelty. It was fundamentally rooted in her belief that Ursa feared or hated her.
So Azula needed constant validation from Ozai because the one person she truly loved, her mother, seemed to reject her.
Yeah, that perception is what pushed her toward obsessive perfection, cruelty, and the need for control. And when Ursa was banished, there was no positive feminine influence left to challenge Ozai's narrative that cruelty and power were the highest virtue.
So forcing Zuko and Azula to work together to find Ursa provides the perfect mechanism for it. Requires Azula to confront the source of her deepest insecurity, faith.
And this is so much more narratively potent than simply having her sit in a cell, which is how the comics eventually portrayed her early post-war life.
By making the search for their mother the focus, it ensures that Azula's arc is tied directly to Zuko's political and process. If Zuko can help his sister and find his mother, he legitimizes himself as a compassionate Fire Lord.
But if he failed, the ghosts of the past remain active. It's a much more emotionally resonant path than the one the comics ultimately took, which often depicted Azula as a recurring strategic antagonist trying to undermine Zuko, rather than a figure of profound psychological tragedy struggling towards self-acceptance.
It really shows the depth of the narrative vision that was sacrificed for the pursuit of the cinematic universe. But the emotional cost wasn't only on Azula and Zuko. It also fell heavily on the shoulders of the protagonist, Aang.
Right, and that brings us to Aang's spiritual burden. Aang achieved what seemed like a clean victory over Ozai in the finale.
He used energy bending to remove Ozai's firebending without having to compromise his Air Nomad value. It seemed like the perfect moral.
Seemed like it. But Aaron Ehasz had a much more complex and frankly much darker perspective on that victory that he never had time to explore fully in the finale.
Okay, what?
This was revealed in a 2019 Comic-Con interview. He was asked about the philosophical implication of energy bend, and Ehasz stated very clearly that in his mind, for every massive action, there's always a cost.
There's always a cost.
That was the core philosophical pillar that got compressed into a quick, almost magical solution because of the runtime constraints of the finale.
So what was the cost for Aang?
The implication Ehasz drew from this idea is massive. He said that by energy bending Ozai, Aang wasn't just passively removing power, he was actively absorbing the spiritual toxicity, the pure malice, and the evil essence of the Fire Lord.
He literally stated, "You took all of this evil into you, and to take it away from someone else means you're holding on to it to protect."
Exactly.
Whoa. So Aang internalized the essence of the Fire Lord's spirit.
Yes.
This recontextualizes the ending entirely. It shifts that perceived clean victory from a moment of peace to the initiation of a serious, lifelong spiritual burden that Aang has to carry.
He's now acting as a permanent spiritual quarantine zone, holding on to the remnants of a century of war, preventing the deepest spiritual corruption from leaking back into the world. It's an enormous...
That doesn't sound like a happy ending at all.
Yeah.
It means Aang, the fun-loving, compassionate kid, has to spend the rest of his life managing the spiritual residue of the man who orchestrated genocide. How would that even manifest in Aang's character? How would this toxicity show up day to day?
Well, we can only speculate based on the internal logic of the Avatarverse, but the psychological toll would be immense. Maybe he'd experience sudden, fleeting moments of political ruthlessness or a profound, uncharacteristic anger.
It could be subtle, right? Like a constant low-level emotional fatigue or a feeling of spiritual coldness that contrasts sharply with his natural warmth.
Right. The darkness would be integrated into his spiritual life. It wouldn't just be a feeling. It would be something he constantly had to suppress or meditate on to keep it contained, threatening the balance within the Avatar state itself.
You know, if you think about Aang's personality in The Legend of Korra, he is sometimes depicted as surprisingly rigid.
He is.
Particularly in his decision to separate the benders and non-benders in Republic City, and he's often distant from his children.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If that rigidity was a subtle manifestation of him having to constantly suppress an internal darkness, he might have imposed structure external to control the chaos internal.
That's a brilliant connection. And once again, Zuko was meant to be the character helping him process.
Of course. Just as Zuko was aiding Azula's recovery from external trauma, he would aid Aang in navigating the internal spiritual fallout of his victory.
Zuko's experience with his own internal darkness, long, arduous path to recovery, and his struggle with his family's legacy, it made him the perfect sounding board.
He would be the emotional consultant for two deeply wounded souls, his sister, broken by hate, and his friend, burdened by absorbed evil.
It beautifully cements Zuko's post-war role. He's not just Fire Lord. He's the great psychological and spiritual healer for the Fire Nation and the Avatar himself.
And both young leaders, having defeated the external enemy, now face the far more difficult internal consequences of that victory. The dynamic is perfect. They move from a partnership defined by a shared enemy to one defined by a shared emotional struggle.
But Aang had a second major storyline, mercifully a much lighter one, that was also lost.
The beginning of the return of the Air Nomad.
Right. This is subsection 2.3. Ehasz revealed this would involve the birth of a child Aang and Katara's first child. But the narrative approach was different from what we ultimately Korra.
Very different. People would begin whispering that a new Air Nomad had been born, a naturally born airbender for the first time in a century.
Which in itself is monumental for Aang, right? It marks the demographic recovery.
But the personal gravity for Aang went deeper than mere population growth. Aang was meant to grapple intensely with the possibility that this child could be the reincarnation of his beloved mentor, Monk Gyatso.
That is a staggering burden to place on a new father. How do you raise your son when you believe he might house the soul of the man who is essentially your father figure, the last connection you have to your lost culture?
It forces Aang to explore the philosophical and emotional depth of reincarnation within the Avatar world in a very, very personal way. Ehasz wanted to explore the theme of friendships and family ties lasting beyond life. The question of whether this child is his son or Gyatso's reincarnation would dominate his parenting.
And we know that Aang ultimately had 3 children, and only Tenzin was an airbender. In The Legend of Korra, Aang often focused his time and attention almost entirely on Tenzin, leaving his other 2 children, Bumi and Kaya, feeling somewhat neglected.
And this lost Season 4 arc might explain that behavior. If Aang truly believed the first natural airbender was the reincarnation of Gyatso, his laser focus on that child's spiritual and cultural link to his past becomes a tragic and driven by duty and profound.
So he is simultaneously dealing with absorbing profound evil, Ozai's toxicity, and witnessing profound spiritual rebirth, Gyatso's possible return.
It's the ultimate thematic balance of light and shadow, spiritual success and spiritual failure, all happening. It gives the Season 4 narrative tremendous. The Azula arc deals with external political.
And Aang's arc deals with internal spiritual healing and the massive weight of his duty, both to the past and future.
Exactly.
Okay, let's move now to the final, most cryptic, and perhaps darkest piece of the 4 puzzle, Iroh and Ko.
This segment relies on the barest thread of information, yet it carries immense fan speculation.
It was revealed in 2019 when Ehasz was directly asked about the future of Ko, the Face Stealer, who remains one of the most chilling and mysterious spirit antagonists.
And his reply was very blunt. He confirmed he, alas, never got to tell the Ko, the Face Stealer story I wanted to tell in Season 4 of Avatar.
And the crucial jaw-dropping addition was that this planned storyline was directly tied to Iroh, the beloved dragon of the West.
And this is where we face the biggest analytical challenge. By the end of Season 3, Iroh has fundamentally transformed. He is a wise, tea-drinking spiritual guide residing permanently in the spirit world.
Right, and Ko rarely leaves his spirit and is a creature of ancient, amoral prediction. How do these 2 worlds logically cross?
It's hard to imagine. Iroh is focused on philosophical peace. Ko is interested in collecting faces and active spiritual theft. Their motivations seem completely divergent.
So why would Iroh, who has achieved spiritual transcendence, risk confronting such a dangerous and...
The long-running fan theory immediately springs to mind, and it must have been the jumping-off point for Ehasz's idea.
The speculation that Ko was somehow involved in the death of Lieutenant Iroh's only son during the siege of Ba Se.
Exactly. This theory gained traction primarily because of a detail spotted by dedicated fans. One of the hundreds of faces Ko showed Aang in his cave bore a slight unsettling resemblance to Lieutenant.
Okay, so if that theory were true, that Ko somehow stole Lieutenant's face, or perhaps his very soul tied to the nature of his death, that provides...
But it also presents a huge narrative hurdle. The Iroh we know at the end of the series is no longer a man driven by revenge or rage. He has moved past his anger, he's achieved his internal peace, and he's even helped his brother find redemption.
So, if he's not seeking revenge, what non-revenge motive could possibly be strong enough to necessitate confronting the Face Stealer? Let's explore the possibilities.
Okay, theory 1. Atonement or bargain. Iroh's greatest grief is the loss of his son, a loss that led him to his spiritual awakening. Perhaps his final step into complete spiritual mastery required him to confront the actual mechanism of that loss. Maybe he needed to bargain with Ko, not for Lieutenant's return, but for the peaceful release of his soul or his face from the spirit world's bureaucracy.
That really aligns with the wisdom of Iroh. He wouldn't fight, he would negotiate. He might approach Ko with humility, offering a different face, or maybe knowledge, philosophical trade to ensure his son's spirit is finally at rest. He's taking responsibility for his past failed father and a...
Okay, theory 2. A test of ultimate wisdom. The Avatar's spirit guides, the ancient, might have required Iroh to pass one final test before fully accepting him into their realm. And this test would be a confrontation with the source of his greatest sorrow.
So if he could face the creature responsible for his son's fate, or at least tied, without falling back into the cycle of hatred, rage, or despair, it would prove his total mastery over self, final demonstration of grace, or the highest possible.
And then there's theory 3. Retrieval of memory or truth. Maybe the confrontation with Ko wasn't about the death itself, but about a missing piece of knowledge that was essential for Zuko or for the history of the Fire Nation.
Oh, that's interesting. So if Ko stole a memory or a truth related to the final days of war, Iroh might seek it not for himself, but for the future stability.
Which would make Iroh the ultimate supporting character for the whole Season 4 theme, healing the world through facing the past. He goes from being the dragon of the West to being the ultimate spiritual detective, seeking lost truths rather than lost battles.
Either way, it's clear that 4 was meant to pull back the curtain on Iroh's past grief, spiritual journey, in a way that the main narrative never had.
It would have been the perfect poignant capstone to the arc of the Dragon of the West. It elevates his grief from just a tragic backstory to a defining moment of spiritual heroism.
When we look back at the scope of The Lost War, it's fundamentally a season of denouement. It was about emotional healing, spiritual consequence, painful redemption, and new beginning. It was the post-war cleanup, the necessary psychological decompression after a century of conflict.
That is the enduring legacy of the lost potential. Aaron Ehasz's ideas would have provided the necessary emotional depth for these characters to truly transition from wartime heroes to post-war leaders and spiritual guides. It was the emotional grounding that followed the high spectacle of Sozon's Comet.
And they sacrificed rich, character-driven narrative structure for the chance at cinematic, a gamble that ultimately cost them the momentum they had built and led to years of creative stagnation.
So what does this all mean now as we look ahead? We are rapidly approaching the release of the new live-action Aang movie from Avatar Studio, and there are constant rumors surrounding that movie and the studio's broader goals for expansion.
And some of those rumors compellingly echo the very ideas we've discussed today, particularly the notion of exploring the consequences of the war on the core characters and facing the ghosts of the past.
Even though Aaron Ehasz isn't currently associated with Avatar Studios, it's highly compelling to think that the sheer creative gravity of these lost Season 4 discussions might still be influencing the new projects.
Yeah.
The ideas were simply too strong, too crucial to the character's growth to stay buried forever.
The themes of Azula's redemption, Zuko's healing role, and Aang's spiritual cost, they're all defining features of the Avatarverse mythology. Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you to consider. Of the three possible universes we discussed, the fully formed, quality-focused animated Season 4, the sprawling corporate cinematic universe, or the slow, careful build of Avatar Studio, which path do you think would have created the most satisfying and enduring future for the franchise?
And we ask you to focus specifically on Aang's spiritual burden. If he had to carry the essence of Ozai's evil for the rest of his life, does that make the finale a more tragic victory or a more profound, self-sacrificing moral achievement? What cost, beyond the physical damage of war, does a great moral victory truly demand of its champion?
That's the question that defines the weight of the Avatar state, and it's the profound depth of storytelling we almost got. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.